First of all, to introduce myself, my name is Ben Newmark, and I'm a history teacher and the vice principal of a school. And here on the call as well, and we'll be speaking to later, are Shaun Webster MBE, who is an activist and accessibility expert. His MBE was awarded for services to the community of those people with learning disability. And we're also lucky enough to have Simon Jarrett on, who is an expert historian in the area of the history of people with learning disability. And in the second half of this talk today, there'll be a question and answer format with both of those, an interview format with me asking the questions and then providing what I'm sure will be illuminating and interesting answers. But to start at the beginning, where it began, well, meet Betsy. On the picture there is my daughter. She's now almost 5. Time moves really fast when you have children. But the time the picture was taken, she was much younger. I think she looks there about 2, and she was just learning to crawl for the first time. About a year after having Betsy, after some delays in reaching typical milestones, I guess is the best way to put it, she was diagnosed with the genetic condition Williams syndrome. Now, Williams syndrome is fascinating. I encourage everyone to straight away go and Google it. It's what we did as soon as we heard. And it's caused by a tiny microdeletion in DNA, which reduces it, which causes a very, very distinct personality profile in many people with Williams syndrome, although we should always be careful not to generalize too much, but also comes with some learning disabilities. Now, I have to be really honest and say, when we first found out about Betsy, it was a shock. It was a difficult time for my entire family because this was a world that I had never, ever encountered before. And learning disability was something I'd never really thought about before. And so I made a conscious effort to find out about learning disability. And as a history teacher, of course, my thoughts very quickly went towards the past and learning disability in the past, and how the lives of people who were like my daughter, although I do very consciously understand how ahistorical that sounds, how they might have been. And I began to investigate and to look into this. I didn't know where to begin, to be honest. So I started with Twitter, and I started asking people who were historians of various different types, and also connecting with other academics who pointed me towards other academics, who pointed me towards other academics, and following this breadcrumb trail, I eventually found some incredibly interesting stuff, which I'd like to talk about briefly now. So when I first started this investigation into the history of learning disability, I did so with some real trepidation because I'm very, very aware of the quite shocking discrepancies in life outcomes that exist today. And I'm aware of shocking degrees of prejudice. I've witnessed it myself. And I was aware of just how poor and marginalized and excluded people with learning disability can be. It's not inevitable, but it can be. And I was expecting to some extent to find things that were worse in the past. I went with real fear, but I felt I had to. One of the things that I've always felt as I've confronted challenges is that when you are scared of something, the fear of it is often far worse than the reality. So I threw myself in, and I was surprised and I was astonished because what I found was not at all what I expected to find. Now, I want to be very clear here and present about the dangers of romanticizing the stories of people with learning disability in the past. And I certainly did not find some utopia in which people with learning disability were included and treated as well as other groups in society. But it wasn't a list of trauma and marginalization. And along with some really tragic stories, I also found stories of great, great love. I found stories that were funny and amusing, and I found stories that were fascinating, and I believed deserved to have a bigger audience, for more people to know about them. And it made me really curious about why this was. They weren't always easy to find, these stories. You tended to find historians like Simon who were working in specialist areas, but they certainly weren't mainstream. But they were there, and it was very, very important to find these. So that's what I found. And as I started to do that, and I'll talk more about that a bit later, I started to codify this into a booklet. But again, the idea of creating a pupil booklet did not start out with the idea that I would teach it in my own school or encourage others to teach it. To begin with, at least, it was simply because that was my lens as a history teacher. when I started to learn about anything new on a curriculum, my instinct was to, for want of a better word, resource it and put it all together. And that's what I did. I also found that the history of people with learning disability, in some ways, and I know that Simon will probably talk about this in more detail later, was hiding in plain sight. It wasn't that these stories weren't there, or that you couldn't find primary stories, sources about people with learning disability. It was often that, and I feel again like I'm stealing Simon Jarrett's phrases here, and I apologize for that, but it's almost like we'd been looking past them. They were hiding there in plain sight. And the image on the screen is a good example of that, because the image, which I'm sure most history teachers will be very familiar with, it's a conventional image of Henry VIII as he probably would like to have been portrayed at the time, surrounded by some members of his family. And we're used to seeing images like that. We're used to seeing the sort of the gaudy kind of opulence of the Tudor court, and it's very comfortable for us. We've framed it in our own cultural consciousness, but it's not the full picture. And in this case, it's not the full picture, quite literally. Have a look at this next slide here. Now here you'll see the full image, but an image that I imagine people will be much less familiar with. And I'd like to draw everybody's attention to the two figures at the extreme margins of the painting. To the left, you have Jane, and to the right, you have Will Sommer. And these are well-documented members of the Tudor court who had learning disability. And of course, they are on the edges of the portraits, but there are lots of members of the court who aren't there at all. And the point for me is that they had been there, they had been known about, they had been talked about, they had been discussed. We do have some record of their voices, in particular Will Sommer. But yet these had just not been included in any of the mainstream history books. Mainstream is probably an unfair term, but the subjects of more common interest, they just hadn't been there. But again, to talk about the point about hiding in plain sight, they had actually been there the whole time. It wasn't that this painting has just been rediscovered. It was that our lens for understanding the Tudor period had been a distinct and particular one and had not included a great number of people. And that to me made it become more pressing, more urgent to try and do something about this, to try and create something that would not just be a record for myself and my family and something that we could look back on, but something that might also broaden the sweep of not just Tudor history, but all sorts of history, and make it clear that history is about, or should be representative of the people who lived in the past if we are to achieve the fullest truth we can. And to do that means including all groups. And in particular, I thought people with learning disability, who are without a doubt amongst the most marginalized, if not the most marginalized group in the society, deserve to be foregrounded, deserve to be brought to the center, and deserve for us to pay them respect and the same attention that we would pay to other groups who we have commonly found more interesting simply by dint of their privilege or their power. So I'd like to talk now about how this project developed and what it entails, and also hope to convince at least some people on this call that it might be worth a punt. It might be worth having a go at putting into what you teach pupils in your schools. For those people who aren't teachers, I hope that it will still be useful, and I hope that the resources that I'm going to go through will be of use in framing and understanding the work that you do if you work with people with learning disability today. Also, I hope that it will be interesting simply for its own sake, and that's not a point I make as a kind of secondary, less important point. I think one of the key functions of history is to fascinate and to enthrall, and I hope that what we've created together will go some way to doing that. So what is it then? So I'll go through all of the things it is in turn, and then I hope to also share some examples of how this curriculum looks in practice, so that you can see how you could consider using it if you wish to. So first of all, the curriculum is primarily a pupil booklet. There are two versions of it. I'll talk about the second version in a moment. And the first version is simply a sequence of lessons that are based on one lesson per week, or perhaps two, could be taught in a half term, a 6-week half term. I know that schools vary in how long the half terms are. Of course, that is a prime opportunity or the prime time for me to acknowledge the limits in scope of my project. This is a history of some people with learning disability, primarily in England, also in Europe, but I certainly would not make any grandiose claims about this being a project that spans the world or spans all time periods. It goes from the prehistoric period, for which our evidence is less strong, right through to the modern day. And for all of the subjects, it includes a number of pages on a cleanly laid out booklet with line numbers. And each of those is accompanied with a lesson PowerPoint. The lesson PowerPoint gives ideas for which questions to ask pupils, and also defines the keywords. Again, a lot of effort went into the lesson PowerPoint, and I should at this point say my thanks to Oliver Cavagoli, who was one of the people who helped clean up my presentation and my booklet to make it usable and functional. The project is also a teacher guide, so everything it comes with a guide on, again, how you might structure this, where it might fit. There is also a narrated teacher guide, which takes the form of me talking. It's a narrated PowerPoint going through everything on the teacher guide, but in more detail, and going into each of those historical periods and talking about the examples of inclusion and exclusion and marginalization, to bring those themes around which the whole curriculum is focused to the fore. We'll talk more about the podcast version later, but also there is now a website which you can see at the bottom, and I know you all have a QR code for as well. And we have a Twitter account, which is at the bottom of this slide as well, the LB History UK Twitter account, where we share the many things that we do. The project, again, I'm smiling as I say it, the project has turned into far more than any of us have expected, garnered far more interest than we ever thought it would. And it is really nice to say that we almost have a weekly update to the events and what's going on. I know just before this call, I was talking to Shaun, who was telling me about another talk that he would like us to get involved in. So once we had got this, once I had written this first version of the booklet, it was really, really important to me that the curriculum that we'd created, the booklet, the PowerPoint, everything else was right. I didn't want to send out something and inadvertently, through my own ignorance or through my lack of scholarship or my lack of reading, end up with something that wasn't representative or was in some way offensive or in some way inaccurate. So before we came anywhere near releasing the curriculum or began to even consider where and when it might be taught, I reached out to lots and lots of people. And in fact, Shaun, who I'll speak to later, was one of the first people I spoke to. And it was Shaun, with some trepidation, who I sent the original version of the curriculum to, because the first thing I wanted to be clear about was that people with learning disability themselves thought that this was a valuable or good thing to do. And I was quite ready to keep this as a personal project and have it go no further if people with learning disability told me, no, actually, we'd rather this wasn't taught in schools, or we think it's too sensitive. To my relief, with some very robust and on-point suggestions, which I'll leave Shaun to talk about later, Shaun did agree that it was a good thing to do and that this would be a project that he thought could really, really build bridges and empower those with learning disability. As well as Shaun, I then made sure that it went out to lots and lots of historians to help me where I'd gone wrong, correct me, point me towards other things. And of course, we are privileged enough on this webinar today to have one of the historians, well, the historian who helped me the most, actually. Let's be clear about that. We've got Simon Jarrett, whose book he'll talk about later was a primary influence. But it wasn't just Simon Jarrett. I was also lucky enough to be helped by some really, really quite famous historians as well. The 16th century girl on Twitter, she gave me some really, really good suggestions. And also Professor Rose Sawyer, who I think works at Leeds University. She was particularly helpful in pointing me out where I'd gone wrong on my section on changelings in the medieval and early modern period. Once I'd done all of that, I sent it out to lots and lots of teachers. And thank you to anybody who's on the call who did help, because I've lost track of all the people who did. And I won't name the people who did help, because if I do, I'm bound to end up leaving somebody out and offending someone who I then later remember was extremely helpful. But that was necessary to make sure that the curriculum we created was usable in a classroom, that it was something that people would be able to pick up and use, and something that would not be so clunky or burdensome or so left field that it couldn't be used in a school. One of the things as a practicing history teacher for many years, as I am now, I'm very aware of, is that teachers are extraordinarily busy people, and that if we're going to make the case to include more representative or more diverse history, it really, really helps if we provide something that can be used quickly in a classroom, that does not require lots and lots and lots of extra work and research to turn it into something that then can be used in a classroom. So it went out to lots and lots of teachers, and I edited and edited and edited according to their feedback. Some things I tinkered with, some things I deleted, and some things I added. And then, of course, I sent it out on Twitter, and I put it out on Twitter to begin with very much we are in beta message. This is my draft. This is where I've got to so far. Could you please tell me where I've gone wrong, or could you please point me towards people who might be able to help with things that I've missed or omitted or left out? And again, some further adjustments to the curriculum were made that way too. And at the end of all that, we ended up with something that I'm quite proud of, that I think that does hold up, that is robust and has now been used in enough schools, and I'll talk about that just shortly, to mean that we do know that it has done some real good, and that it is being used by lots and lots of schools in ways that help their pupils and pupils find interesting. So again, I wanted to quickly talk about, very quickly, give people an idea who haven't seen the booklet about what it looks like, just so if you were considering using this, you could have an idea of what you were getting yourself into, what you were signing yourself up for. And the next slide, the one that hopefully has just come up, shows a typical layout for the booklet there. You can see that it's nicely formatted, it's clearly laid out. We've got line numbers in there because, as all teachers know, these are incredibly useful when you're reading with a class. And all references that I've used are put into the main body of the curriculum, and are available if they're clickable on an electronic version if you download it off our website, so that if you're interested, or pupils are interested, or anyone else is, it makes it easy to follow the breadcrumbs and find much more. Of course, with the scope of this project being aimed to be over a half term, 6 weeks, maybe 1 or 2 lessons a week, it simply is not possible to include all of the interesting and fascinating stories that I found, and Simon obviously knows much more about. So editing has been necessary, and there is so much more to find. Again, here's an example of what the PowerPoint might look like. Again, we've kept it really simple so that teachers can adapt and revise and move it around if they want to. And as you can see, this is what the second slide would look like for each of the accompanying PowerPoints to go with each topic in the booklet, which are divided into lessons. So there are some focus questions, some words to define, and other than that, it's left pretty much up to the teacher. We find the usual format is pretty much similar to the way schools generally teach history these days, with some retrieval practice at the beginning, and then some reading and some discussion around those questions, and then maybe some extended writing, or at least some shorter writing on those questions. And that's the way the whole curriculum works. It's structured around the second order concepts of change and continuity, and that's looking at exclusion and inclusion, the different ways in which people with learning disability have been included and also included in the societies they live in. So that's that. I also wanted to quickly share one of the stories from the booklet with you, and I just want to read this just to give you a taste of how interesting some of these stories can be. And so all I'm going to do is read this, and this is the story of a young man called Thomas who was lived in the 1700s, in the late 18th century. I'll say no more, but I'll read it to you just so you can get a sense of the sort of stories that do appear in this curriculum. So in 1780, a poor young skin gatherer who worked in a London meat market appeared in court accused of having been in a riot. Regularly teased by other boys, Thomas Baguette was accepted to be an idiot who did not really understand the value of money and would do no work unless he had to. Witnesses claimed he had been seen drunk, helping destroy a house. Shocked by the level of violence in the riot, the government encouraged harsh sentences. Thomas could be hanged. His life was at stake. At Thomas's trial, 6 witnesses appeared in his defense, which included his workmates, his employer, his sister, and his mother. 3 other people provided character witness statements. All the witnesses provided Thomas with alibis, claiming he had been with them at the time of the riot. The only thing consistent about the statements was Thomas wasn't at the riot. He couldn't possibly have been with all the people who said he was with them at the same time. The judge clearly knew this and warned the witnesses they could get themselves into trouble for perjury, which means lying to court. He told them to be careful. They did not change their stories, with one saying, "Well, I am very careful," and very sure he was employed in the yard until dinner time. It seems pretty clear Thomas had taken part in the riot, but the jury chose to go along with the witnesses' stories and acquitted him, probably because they thought the best place for him was in his community with his family and friends. Thomas's life was not perfect. From the witness statements in the court, we know he was teased and probably often treated badly. But when his life was at stake, the people who knew him were willing to risk their own freedom to stop him being punished for committing a crime they knew he might not have really understood. When push came to shove, he was one of their own. The judge and jurors were also happy to collude with the stories of Thomas's friends, showing that they too thought the best place for him was in his community with his friends and family. So the reason I share that story is, again, it's one of those examples of hope that I saw when I started looking back into the history of people with learning disability. This idea that far from being marginalized in every community that they lived in, people with learning disability contributed, they worked. Thomas was a skin gatherer. And also that they had enough agency and enough voice to be able to cause enormous protectionism and sympathy among their family and friends. So remember, in this case, there were a number of people here who could have got themselves in serious trouble, but something about Thomas meant that they were willing to risk their own lives to help him. And I think that this was unexpected, and the curriculum that we've planned and put together contains other stories like this too, which are very, very heartening and encouraging. So as I said before, the next stage, and this is where Shaun comes in, and I've got some questions to ask Shaun later. But one of the first challenges Shaun threw back at me when I sent in the curriculum was, it's all very good, Ben, it's fine, but what about people whose literacy isn't great? What about people with learning disabilities who don't read as well as people without learning disabilities? It seemed to me that immediately Shaun was right, and it was potentially enormously problematic that a curriculum could be created about people with learning disabilities, but it would be inaccessible to those who had them. And so Shaun set about helping me make a second version of the booklet, which would be more accessible, which would be clearer, which would be much more easily understood, not just by people with learning disabilities, but anybody who struggles with literacy. And it was our hope that through doing this might be used in special schools as well, or schools with pupils with learning disabilities attending mainstream settings, something that would mean we could all take part in this history. It could be something that we are all doing together. And from that came the podcast, which is a rather, well, to me, rather wonderful story. We decided that we needed to create a version of this for people who couldn't read at all, for whatever reason. And we decided that this should be read by people with learning disability, if possible. And so we set about creating a set of scripts, podcasts, all done remotely and all done in pandemic conditions. So all files emailed back to each other and then edited and then stitched together by a professional producer I'll talk about more. in order to get something that would last forever, could be on a podcast and could be listened to by people who weren't able to access the curriculum in the written form. What was wonderful about this was right from the start, we were determined that the people who read for this project would be paid. Both Shaun and I feel that people with learning disability already do far too much volunteering, and that as this was meaningful work and work that is expert work because it was created by people, there were no more qualified people to do this than the people we found to do it. We decided that we wanted to pay them, and so I set up a crowdfunder, I think on GoFundMe, and expected it to take a few months for there to be enough money to pay everyone, but in actual fact it took a weekend, and we were able to pay everybody for making this podcast, which as is everything else, is available on our website. I hope that some people will take the time to listen to that, all completely free, of course. After that, we decided we wanted to get this out there and to have as many schools as possible doing it. And I was lucky enough to be working at Lodge Park Academy, where our principal, Carly Waterman, was very keen for the project, the curriculum to be taught in its entirety, and actually ended up not being taught in history lessons, but being taught in PSHE lessons. And that was a wonderful, and actually, I mean, not that it matters, and there are, of course, lots more important things that happen in the world, but was recognised in our Ofsted report as being a real area of strength, which was lovely. It was also nice to see that the project got picked up by an elite, a selective sixth form, Harris Westminster School in London, and their principal there, James Hanscom, was a very, very prominent early supporter of the project, and has emailed me some wonderful work produced by sixth formers there about their reflections on the project. And also the Castle Mead Academy, part of the Mead Academy Trust, also hugely supportive and being taught there. So I know there are other schools using it, either in part or in its entirety, and it's just nice to see that this project has actually garnered far more influence than I ever thought it would. So what's next? Next steps, and this is almost ready for me to hand over to Shaun, who's going to answer some questions about the project. But the next part of the project really is down to Shaun. Shaun felt passionately that one of the problems in researching and finding out the history of people with learning disability had been the more difficult to find primary sources. And so we decided that what we'd like to do is start interviewing people with learning disability and recording those interviews. And so we would then be able to create a record, if you like, an archive of the life histories of people with learning disability, so that if anyone in the future wanted to write a history of what it was like to live through the pandemic, or what it was like to live with learning disability in the 1980s, the 1990s, right through to the present day, that will be there. And that's the next stage of the project. The first of those interviews has been done, which was me interviewing Shaun, but the next stages will be more of that. And that's my part of this presentation finished with, apart from any questions at the end. And I'm now ready to ask Shaun some questions about his involvement. Shaun, can you hear me? Are you ready to unmute?
I can, yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Perfect, good, Shaun. So without further ado, Shaun, could you please briefly introduce yourself and explain how you first found out and then became involved in this project?
Okay, Ben. Yes. My name is Shaun Webster MBE. I got learning disabilities. I'm a father, and I work for a living. My friend Stabber, who I've been working on a book with, she knows I like history. We got talking about history, and I did Stabber. I never had any good lessons, history lessons about people with learning disabilities, and not even anything about us. And she told she got her thinking, and she got me in touch. She got me in touch with Ben, and I got to know Ben, and we were talking about my experience in special schools, and not getting great history lessons. It was fairly typical World War II, World War I, not much else. I learned more about history from outside the school. I was in the school, like everything else. I've got, and I feel like a moment the history lessons and booklets were whitewashed about people with learning disability, and I think that needs to change.
Thanks, Shaun. You've answered a few of my questions in one, so I'm going to skip forward a bit, if that's all right.
Yep.
And I'm going to ask you, Shaun, what would you have liked to have learned about in school, but you didn't?
I wanted to learn about all types of history from World War I, all types of wars, about people with learning disabilities, typical lives, whether working, or maybe talk about people with learning disabilities or LGBTQ+. I want to know about everything, not just about same old, but what about, about all type of lives with people with learning disability, what jobs they do, what type of life they do, what part of history they were a part of. I want to know everything, not same old, same old. I want to know everything. I want to be opened and wide about everything.
So why do you think, Shaun, the history of people with learning disability is not taught about in schools that much, or it hasn't been up to this point? Why do you feel that?
I do feel like if they're not interested to know about us, it feels like we just be edited out of all type of history. We feel like we're not important. We feel like we are like second-class people in the in sessions. It got me annoyed about history lesson, but they never talked about anything about it. They always talked about all the famous people in the past, but people with learning disabilities were forgotten. I got really frustrated with it, and I didn't really enjoy the history lessons when I was younger, because they don't talk about people with learning disabilities at all. Not from the Roman time, not to the Victorian time. They never talked about us at all. I felt really angry about that.
Yeah, I can understand, Shaun. It's that thing is, I can't imagine what it must have been like to have gone through an entire history curriculum and never seen people with learning disability recognised at all. I mean, did you learn about anybody about learning disability when you were at school?
I'll be honest, we didn't learn nothing about people with learning disability, and I didn't even understand about my own learning disability, probably too. If we talked about learning disability, if they did, I think I would understand my learning disability better if they talked about it, about people with learning disability in the past, but they never talked about that. I thought it was a missed opportunity if they talked about people with learning disabilities in the past. I feel people like myself will be treated equal, respected, and valued, and not be treated like we're second class. We want to be treated like everybody else. That way, if they talked about history, about people with learning disability, I think all type of barriers will break down.
What sort of school did you go to, Shaun?
I went to a special school. It was very good. I left that school out reading and writing. The only thing what interested me about the school was history lesson, because I did like it, but I was frustrated about it, and maths. I left that school knowing about history, but not knowing about history. I just knowing about the typical, not about people like us.
Yeah, the reason I asked, Shaun, is it's just to make it clear, isn't it, that you attended a school in which it sounds like there were a number of pupils who had learning disability, but you didn't want to learn about people with learning disability in your history lessons. Is that right?
It was that, because it was Domino's frustrated about they have a typical history lesson. It was just all they really talking about World War II, World War One, and maybe Waterloo, nothing else. It was just, and with Domino's, then it could have been more than that. But why they not talk about people with learning disabilities? I left that special school feel lost about people like myself, because we're not learning history about us, and it was frustrated.
Thank you. Thanks, Shaun. I think that the other questions I had for you, you've answered in your really passionate and articulate answers to the other questions. So I know I'm going to hand over for questions for Simon, but I know that you've got...
Yeah, not the end of the 8th picture. but what I feel frustrated about is that they edited people with learning disabilities out of it, and I thought angry about that, because I feel like they're not what people like us in any type of history. I feel like they were a perfect history, but not what people like us in it, and I thought frustrated a bit.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, and I think that Henry VIII painting just really sums it up in such a very obvious way, that actually these two people are just so often cut out of the painting. And I think there are two things that happen in this history. So one is that sometimes people get cut out in that way. Now, you were just talking about how at school it was all about World War One and World War Two, and you were interested in those, but you were frustrated because you weren't learning anything else, and you weren't learning anything about the history of people you saw as being like yourself, or or anything else. Now, one of the really interesting things about World War One and World War Two is that people with learning disabilities played a part in both of them. So in World War One, we are actually uncovering records of people who were classified at the time as mental defectives. The language changes all the time, who actually joined up, sometimes directly from mental defective colonies or institutions, and fought in the war. And not only that, but also when a lot of the men who worked in the factories went off to fight in the war, a lot of people who'd been classified as mental defectives and told they needed to live in hospitals and couldn't work and couldn't do this and that, suddenly went and worked and did highly skilled jobs in the in the factories. So there was a really important involvement of people in that war, which never gets told. And the next bit of research that I'm working on is about World War II. And there was a part of the British Army which was known as the Pioneer Corps. And that was the part of the army that built bridges, transported stuff around, did the catering, put up barbed wire fencing, all the sorts of logistics. Yeah. And again, what I'm finding in the research is that lots of people who, when they applied to join the main army, were classified as being mentally deficient, and they didn't want to put them into the main army because they thought they couldn't do this and do that, ended up in the Pioneer Corps and did really well, and ended up on the front line, showing tremendous bravery in all the different theatres of war that occurred in World War II. So I think we've got a pattern here where actually people with learning disabilities are always there. They're always a part of things, but we have a tendency, well, not we don't, but there is a tendency to push people out of this history and ignore their contribution, partly because I think people don't think they're able to make a contribution. So I think that happens. And we have a similar thing from World War One, where colonial troops, troops from India, troops from various African countries, their role in that war isn't considered. The role of women in the war isn't considered. So all of these groups are sort of pushed to the side and not made part of the main story. The other thing I'd quickly add is something that Ben said at the beginning. So sometimes people are cut out, but sometimes people are there and we just don't see them. So a lot of people would look at that Henry VIII painting, even if it was the full version, and not have a clue who those two people were on the two sides. So they'd be seeing them, but they'd not really be seeing who they were. And one of the things I talk about in my book is actually how loads of art and caricature actually included people with learning disabilities, and we look at them, but we don't see them.
Another thing, can I ask you another question, please? Myself, I got learning disability. I'm bisexual. I feel like in the history, they don't talk about people with learning disability or LGBTQ+. I feel like we have, again, forgotten. We might be in a background, but they don't talk about us or anything. I wondered about that type of history too, about how about people with learning disability being gay, bisexual, transgender, and anything else. Where they talk about that in school, in history lessons too.
Yeah, well, it's right, and I think, you know, the more um, sort of minorities you're a part of, if you like, the more you disappear down this rabbit hole where you don't get seen, or you know, some historians don't want to see you. So if you've got a learning disability, you're often not seen. If you're gay, you're often not seen. If you're a learning disability, if you have a learning disability and you're gay, you're not seen even more. You know, so I think but you know, that's the story. But what's sort of exciting about that story is that there is all this untold history for us to find out about and tell the stories. And I should say there's a terrific piece of work being done about people in World War One by a person called Lee Hubbard, who did an inclusive research project with a group of people with learning disabilities in Oxford and uncovered a lot of this history about World War One. And then amazing things happened, just like Ben makes amazing things happen about history that people have worked on. And Magpie Dance Company, which is a dance company in London, did this beautiful dance representation of the work about people with learning disabilities in World War One that they ended up doing in collaboration with the Royal Ballet, and which was performed, you know, in one of the studios at the Royal Opera House. So incredible things come from this when these histories are unearthed and these partnerships and collaborations happen. You're muted, Ben.
I get that a lot. Sometimes people prefer it. That I was saying, that was fascinating. I'm just listening to the conversation between you two. Then was an education for me. Simon, I've got a couple of general questions now because, well, the first is, what's your background and what drew you to specialise in the history of people with learning disability in the first place? Why choose this?
Okay, well, I didn't actually start out as an academic. I've ended up as one, but I actually have a background in working with people with learning disabilities, supporting people with learning disabilities, mainly adults. And I started out, you know, some years ago, a few decades ago. But I first of all worked with children with learning disabilities, but in an area in Hertfordshire, just outside London, which was absolutely littered with the old mental handicap hospitals that people from London used to be sent to. I became very fascinated by these. They still had patients in them at the time. This was in the 1980s. And they had railway tracks going into them where people used to be transported from London. They had graveyards where people used to be buried. And they were like these little worlds that were parallel to the world that everybody else lived in. And I then went on to work with adults, and I even had a 9-month stretch working, stretch I think is the right word, working in one of these hospitals just before the hospital closures began, and experienced that very strange world that people were sent to live in. And I write about this a bit at the beginning of my book. And I then worked with people who were coming out of the hospitals and back into the community when the Care in the Community project happened. So in all of this, I became very fascinated by this history and thought, you know, how did these people end up in these places, and why did they end up in these places, and who decided that they should live apart in this very odd parallel world from everybody else. And you know, that led to a lot of sort of historical inquiry for me. I began to notice that a lot of people who worked in the field didn't really have much of a historical sense of, you know, what had happened in the past of the people that they worked with. They were very much focused on the present, and that all of that led me to an interest in researching and writing the story, and I ended up doing a PhD at Birkbeck, you know, some of which forms part of the book.
Thank you. Yeah, fascinating. I think, yeah, there's a lot there that I could see Shaun kind of nodding along and me thinking about as well, which is that thing, isn't it? Like that the idea of institutionalizing or putting people somewhere separate is one of those things that is kind of there in terms of like our cultural understanding. But then when you actually start asking the questions about why we did that, it suddenly becomes very, very uncomfortable. Shaun, have you got a question?
I seen that happening in real life. I went to Bulgaria, Moldova, and Czech Republic. I thought institution. I was upset. I was just born after all the institutions was shut down. Well, I was born in 1972, but I was lucky I was not in them type of institution. If I was born earlier, I could be in one of them. But when I went to Czech Republic, Bulgaria, and Moldova, they're proper institutions. It was very cramped areas. I felt quite, oh God, it was quite heartbreaking. And we went there to train social workers to get them into the community, more in small homes or support homes. But every time we met new friends, but it was heartbreaking seeing it. And then I went to one institution for babies, and they learned not to cry. And me and my support worker left out of that building quite upset. I did what institution were. Oh God, it was too much. If I was born maybe 30 years, 20 years earlier, I could be in an institution. But I was born in the 70s, but I had to go to a special school, and my mum didn't want me to go there. We had no other option. Oh, I do things like that. I never forget that. To me, it's part of my history. But I don't want people to go back to them days again. It's horrible.
Yeah, thanks, Shaun. I'd say at this point as well, before I go on to my next question, that if anybody does want to really get into this and find out more about it, really the best place to start that I've come across is Simon's book, his latest book, Those They Called Idiots, which I'd like to ask him a bit about that now. First of all, Simon, what inspired you to write this? And I'm also curious about the title. What made you go for that title?
Okay, well, what interested me was actually that a lot of the history was about these asylums, which had really built up from the middle of the 19th century, gone through towards to the late 20th century, to the 1980s, and then been replaced by what we call care in the community. And the big question that kept coming up to me was, what happened before the asylums, though? If those started in the middle of the 19th century, where were people before they went into them? And that was what I started to research. And that was where the title of the book came from, because language is a real minefield in this area of study, right? So you begin with the term idiots, which we all know is a term of abuse now, and then it goes through all these iterations through to the present day. And so you have idiots and imbeciles and mental defectives and morons and cretins and the mentally handicapped and the subnormal, and so on. I mean, I only have to say those words for us to realize the role that language has played in this history, and how marginalized a group this can be, that the terms that are used to describe them so quickly become abusive terms and marginalizing terms. So I deliberately chose this title. It was a little bit provocative, but I want to say, so these are the people that actually were called idiots in the past. And actually, we've then gone through all these iterations, but actually this is a similar group under each new name, and it's that group that society sees as being less intelligent than the rest, less capable than the rest. And the historical story is all about what different societies, how they react to that group and what they do to that group, or, you know, at times how they support that group. And so what I really wanted to say was this is a history. It goes through from the 18th century through to the current day, about a group of people that were those they called idiots, and have gone through lots of other name changes, but have basically been the same group in society throughout that time. Yeah.
Thank you. And we're getting towards the end now. But the question I'm particularly fascinated about is, as we've been saying, sometimes the sources aren't easy to find. So what's your process, Simon? Like, how do you go about finding these stories, and where do you look?
Yeah, well, this is a really important issue about this, and it's one of the reasons why this history hadn't been told, particularly before the 19th century. One of the reasons a lot of the history was about the asylums and things was that the asylums have records, right? And historians tend to get attracted to institutional records, and so you're going to find something about learning disability if you look into an idiot asylum records from the 19th century. Now, what was really interesting when I started to look into this was that very few historians were looking at the 18th century, which was an area I wanted to look at. And those who had looked in 18th century institutions, of which there weren't many. Not many people got put into institutions in the 18th century. And they said, we've been through all these records. We found the mentally ill, we found the physically disabled, we found the blind. We can't find the so-called idiots. But the conclusion that they drew from that was that therefore meant that this group must have been incredibly marginalized because they weren't even in the institutions, So there was this assumption, which was actually built on nothing, that people must have therefore been dreadfully abused, locked in cellars, locked in attics, sat on walls in villages with people lobbing stones at them and things like that. Which actually tells us a lot more about our current day assumptions than it does about what happened then. Because why would you assume that people were treated like that if you've got no evidence for it? So I thought, well, if they weren't in institutions, then maybe they were in mainstream society. So if I'm going to find this group, I'm going to look in mainstream records, and I'm going to see if there are references to idiots and imbeciles or whatever. So I actually began with the Old Bailey trial records, and I'd recommend these to anybody. There's a fabulous website called Old Bailey Online where all these reports from court cases from the late 17th century through to the early 20th century have all been digitized. The Thomas Baguette story, that fabulous story which Ben told so beautifully at the beginning about the guy that got caught up in the Gordon riots in 1780, that is in the Old Bailey records. And in fact, I found about 60 criminal trials where people were referred to as idiots, or he's half an idiot, he's next thing to an idiot. And what became absolutely fascinating was this community solidarity around them, and the fact that they were part of families, they were working, they were part of neighbourhoods and communities, and that there were people who supported them. Sometimes people had bad lives, most people had bad lives in the 18th century, but there were always these networks around them. They were rarely hung, when they went on trial. Very often they were acquitted. Basically, the neighbourhood was told, look after them, stop them, getting into any trouble anymore. I looked in civil trials, so this was more middle class people than the poorer people you tend to get in the Old Bailey trials. And so people where there were doubts over their capacity to marry, their capacity to manage their own affairs, capacity to inherit money, and so on. And the same pattern evolved, and everywhere I looked then, I started to look in art and caricature, and we knew what people in the 18th century thought that people with learning disabilities looked like, because there were descriptions of it about their physiognomy, about what their face looked like and their facial features. And suddenly we just saw people everywhere, and we saw them, I saw them working, I saw them just out, unremarkable, on the streets. Found people in novels. I found people in sermons that preachers like Wesley made to huge crowds in 18th century towns and cities, where there were references to how much better a person with very limited intelligence was, who had faith in God, than a person who was very highly educated but was devious and didn't really have good faith in God. So there were all these indicators that actually people did belong, And so, sorry, that was a very long answer to your question, but I think in terms of sources, I think it's really incredibly important that people look in mainstream sources, don't just look in institutional records. And you will find people everywhere. you know. And it's like I said at the beginning, they're there, but we often look straight through them, and we don't see them properly.
Thank you, Simon. I think my very last question I'd like to ask Shaun, actually, if you don't mind, Shaun. Yeah, Shaun, my last question is, like, how did it make you feel when you saw about the history about people with learning disability before the institutions, in the Middle Ages and the Tudor periods? Was that new to you? Was that surprising to you? How did it make you react?
When you first told me that, how very, very surprised. I didn't even know that. I didn't know people like myself in that time who were more included in the community, part of the workplace. They never talked about that in Israel, the school I went to, but it was a big surprise to me. It didn't like in them time, it didn't like, I'm not better, but it didn't like they were more inclusive in that time. But when it got later in the 18th and 19th century, didn't like people was more respected and included in that community because they had a school to give out, their own life skills, and the thing that they were really, like, they were more included in the family in them times too. He's done ways in the old times to let people we learned to be more valued, what skills they got, what they could give to the community. But now, in the last 200 to 300 years, they were forgotten, and that, to me, that is makes a big the missed out very much. People with learning disability got a lot of skills and experience they could give to people. Like myself, I'm not brainy or anything, but I got life experience. I can open my work friends out, I mean bosses out, because I got a lot of life experience. But in some ways, I wish I could live in the past with them. I think I've been more included. But our books will make this change, because our book will make a difference. Because if we could teach them about the past, we could open their minds, we could change their attitude, we'll break down barriers. People with learning disability are not second-class citizens. We are human beings. We got a lot to give, and we need to be respected for that. And that's why history to me is very important. All type of history is important, but people with learning disability can't be forgotten. We're a part of it. We're not a window. We're not looking for the window. We're part of it.
Thank you, Shaun. That's beautifully put. And I think Simon might have one thing to say, but I think we might need to keep it brief, Simon, because I think we're down to our last.
Don't worry, I can't follow that. That was a brilliant summary to end it all.
Yeah, that's basically it. No one wants to speak after Shaun has just finished with that. Thank you, everyone.
That was, I have no words. That was wonderful. Thank you so much, and there are so many votes of thanks coming in from people on the chat at the moment. Yeah, I mean, how do you follow that? I mean, I think from my own point of view, I have a very mild learning disability in that I had quite severe dyslexia and dyspraxia, especially as a child. Well, I still have it now, but I've had lots of help to overcome it, and physical disability. So I was born with something called double telepathy, so double club feet, and about as severe as you can get. And actually, I remember this brought up a lot of memories in my mind of being in school and thinking that I'm different somehow, and I never see people like me. I'm dyslexic, I must be stupid. And actually, I think this is incredibly pertinent, and is perhaps the most important webinar we've ever had on Big World History. So thank you all three of you so much. That was wonderful and inspirational, and yeah, fantastic. There have been a couple of questions that have come in the Q&A, so I'm going to ask those first, and then I've got one question I'd like to ask at the end, if that's okay, if you'll indulge me. So the first comes from Jo. She says, I would like to ask Shaun about his experience as a parent with a learning disability. Many of our members, so all Wales people first, do not even get the opportunity to be parents in the first place. It's assumed they would not be safe to bring up their own children. Yet we know with a little bit of support, they would be excellent parents.
Yeah.
In the non-learning disability world, we don't even question anybody's ability to be parents, I'm assuming here. And we seem to wait until a serious abuse case comes to light before we reactively take action. She just wonders, Jo, for you, Shaun, and others feel free to come in as well, what your experience of fatherhood has been. Have you had to fight to be a parent of your child at all?
Yes, I never got my kids took away, but it was very difficult to be a parent a lot of the time, because my partner really did have learning disabilities, but my issue were, I feel like every time I want to say if I'm doing something or punish them, I thought undermined. I just felt like I want to be listened to, and that one of my biggest frustrations were not being the partner to have a voice with my children. But a lot of children, a lot of parents with learning disability, I know, get the kid took away because they think they got learning disability. Oh, you can't look after your kids. A lot of parents with learning disability told me they asked for the part, but never listened to them, and it's always a crisis for them. Always a crisis, but they want the part at the beginning, but they don't listen to it. They think, oh, you've got learning disability, you can't be a good parent. We can be a good parent. We demand the part from day one on our terms because we need it. But over time, the part will be less. But they don't listen to us at all. They think because we've got learning disability, we can't look after our kids. We can look after kids. We want the part from the beginning, not when it's a crisis, like myself. I never got my kids took away, but my experience were my partner didn't listen to me at all. She thinks I can't be a good dad. It was quite upsetting to me. But over time, I got to know my kids better. They know I'm a good dad because I listen to them with the problems, everything. But I just wish I wish that I had the part from the day one with my partner, and that was one of my frustrations was. But for other parents, we learn disability in Wales, England, and Scotland, and Northern Ireland, we demand to be parents, not take our kids away from us. We want the part from the beginning, not when it's a crisis. What they're doing to parents with learning disability is a human rights issue. It's wrong. We want to part from day one, not when it's a crisis. We demand that.
Yeah, and I think that point's really pertinent, isn't it? And comes back to what Jo was saying around, you know, we don't question perhaps in other situations that are potentially far less supportive.
That what kept parents frustrated. If you're a parent without learning disability, you get to keep the kids. But you're a parent with learning disability, you don't.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a question, in fact, a couple of questions coming in from Catherine that I think are more kind of directed at you, Ben. So Ben, I'm assuming Catherine isn't a teacher, and she's asking advice on for those who are not teachers. Might you approach local schools to advocate for the inclusion of this in the curriculum? She's saying she has links to both mainstream and special schools, but I guess for those who don't, is that something that you might suggest, advocate? What would you say in relation to that?
Well, I hope we can help. I mean, one of the things that I think schools find really hard, and I have great sympathy for schools, is when people turn around to school and says you should do more of X and just leave it at that, because that then leaves all the resourcing and the planning and everything else for the school, and that's tough and difficult. I hope that if anyone did approach a school they had links with or didn't have links with our website and with the curriculum and said, look, it's done. You know, there is the resources there, the curriculum is there, the PowerPoints go alongside the curriculum is there. There's a teacher guide to go there as well. If you want to know more, there's a PowerPoint presentation where it's all talked through. It's quite easy to do, you know, like you can just do it. I'd say also, I mean, don't be precious about where it goes in the curriculum. We taught it in PSHE at Lodge Park Academy, part of the DRET chain, and that worked fine. I'd also say that for me, it's not an all or nothing. I mean, the curriculum was designed to be in some ways a bit detachable, like in terms of you wouldn't have to teach all of it at once. You know, if you were teaching a Key Stage 3 and there was you were teaching the Tudors, well, then there is material from there you could put in there, and that would only take a lesson, or even not being precious about the idea of having to have curriculum time, anything to start, you know, saying that there's a ready-made homework project there for you as well if you don't feel that you can find the space. Just pointing out the different ways it can be done. I mean, the only thing I would say is that, and I made this clear, I think, on the teacher guide, is that I know a lot of schools do kind of a history of medicine. Please don't put it in that. Like, that's the only thing I insist on. Like, please don't put it as part of the history of medicine. People with learning disability are not ill, they're not sick. And that's where all the problems have been. So don't try and whack it into that study. That's the only thing I asked that I'm precious about.
Spot on. Spot on. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I do wonder whether, and Simon, this is kind of more of a question really, so feel free to dive in. But I do wonder as well whether there's so I teach migration through time at GCSE, and I don't know, are there opportunities, Simon, where we might be able to bring learning disability history in there? I don't know if there are examples that we have of people with learning disabilities who are migrating to the UK.
Well, you've certainly got a big story there in the United States. So the tests which were laid out for immigrants arriving at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, were very much predicated on the new science of IQ and about keeping out, people that were known as mental defectives at the time. So I think you'll find that one of the big factors in sort of anxieties and concerns about migration, not just into America, but lots of migration, lots of people that belong to this other group suddenly going to start flooding into this country, So I think there is definitely some potential. I mean, it really goes back to what I was saying earlier, that really in anything that happens, a certain proportion of the people involved in that thing that happens are going to be people with learning disabilities. It's just a question of trying to dig out their stories in one way or another. So I think there's all sorts of ways that people can adapt it. And can I just say very quickly just how thrilled I was and impressed by the work that Ben did, first of all, to actually get this stuff into a format where it could be used in the curriculum, and the speed and the energy with which he did that. And one of the things I really wanted from writing my book was that it would reach out far beyond academia. I deliberately put it with a general publisher, not an academic publisher, and I wrote it for the public. I didn't write it for academics. And so then the work that Shaun did alongside Ben to make the history accessible to people with learning disabilities, I just think is absolutely brilliant. And if I could have asked for just one thing to happen as a result of my book, it would have been this.
Yeah, it's a wonderful resource. I think that would be a lovely place to finish, but there's actually more questions that are coming, and I think we should answer them. Catherine, I kind of veered off her questions earlier, so I will get through those as well. Ben, she's wondering, is there a rough kind of age range you suggest that's best suited, or could it be adapted to other age groups?
Well, I know that it's, again, as I said before, I'm not precious about it being revised, edited. The reason that, I think I have put Word versions up. If not, if you just contact me through the website and I'll put Word versions back to people. I'm not precious about people editing it at all, as long as nothing is changed that actually changes the meaning of what was said. And with that in mind, I know that it's being used all the way from year 7 It's being used with people with learning disability, all the way up to the Harris Westminster highly selective sixth form in London. And I know that they've done some work on extending it. They've used Simon's book rather than just using what's in the booklet, and they've gone further. So I think that it can be used in every age range from 7 all the way up to 17 or 18, I think, if people are willing to do a bit more work around it. I think, again, I was saying before about how to use it in schools. I mean, when I said all of the support and stuff we've put on the website, and I don't want to sound like a diva or sound too precious, but we have done that deliberately. The other thing I don't like the idea of is people just thinking, oh, that'll do, printing it out on a Friday and whacking out to all their teachers on Monday morning and say, yeah, teach that. I think that for anything to have worth and meaning, a bit of time needs to be spent having a think about it, even if it's only an hour in an inset session or a webinar or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the final question from Catherine is around kind of outcome information. So I guess she's talking really about, are there any impact studies that have been done yet, or kind of feedback from students about how they've enjoyed it?
Yeah, I mean, we're not measuring it. I don't think we have any plans to measure it in terms of test outcomes or anything like this. I don't think, I've not had a big problem with that, by the way. I'm not making some big curriculum stance here. I just don't think that's what this is for. But having said that, we have had some lovely feedback. I mean, it's all out in the public domain now, but in the midst of a tough but rigorous Ofsted inspection, one of the Ofsted inspectors said that they'd asked every child they'd spoken to, what is the one thing that you remember learning this year? And every single child they asked, every single one said the history of people with learning disability that we did in PSHE. And so, I admit that was a pressurized time anyway, a slightly emotional moment for me to realize that. But yeah, I mean, I think for me that, no one told them to say that. They were asked an open question by an impartial observer who was just there to capture the school, and that's what they came up with. So I think that for me was good enough for the time being.
That's lovely. That really is lovely. So last question from Dawn then. At what point, and maybe this is a bit more of a historical conceptual question to finish on, but at what point does the past become present? How do we teach about the present within the context of the past for people perhaps with learning disabilities?
Well, I think that's for Shaun and Simon, so I'm going to mute myself, and that's for Shaun and Simon, that one.
Well, I'll say first, because I think it's going to be very appropriate for Shaun to finish this, and I don't want to follow Shaun anyway, because he'll be better than me. So I like to tell a story. There's a historian called Jan Walmsley, who was a real pioneer in the history of learning disability and of doing co-produced history with people with learning disabilities. Jan became interested in this subject when she was invited into the Open University in 1980s and was asked to write a course about why people with learning disabilities should be able to lead an ordinary life, because there was a document around at the time which was called An Ordinary Life, and it was saying people shouldn't live in hospitals, they should be able to live in houses and have jobs and live an ordinary life. Jan knew nothing about learning disability, and she said, why have we got to write a course about why people with learning disabilities should be able to lead an ordinary life? Isn't it obvious they should be able to lead an ordinary life? And then she said, but then I realized they couldn't lead an ordinary life because of the past, right? So the shadow of the past fell completely over the present, and everything that happens today has been formed by this history, that we've been talking about tonight. And so I think that the past is completely and utterly infuses the present.
What I do in my work, I use my past experience to change attitudes. My dad said to me, he was not a nice person, but he said I will never get a job, never live on my own, never get married, never have a normal life. I proved him wrong. And I feel like I'm making my own history. I'm breaking the past because I'm proving people wrong about me, and inspiring other people to make their own history, to have a life that they want. And I feel like I'm proud to do that. I worked in a lot of different countries. I feel like I inspire other people to have jobs, to have relationships, and make their own future Italy for themselves. Because yes, past it was bad, but it was good too. But we got to make our own history now, and inspire other people with learning disability to prove people wrong about us. Because we want to be equal like everybody else, not treated like kids. And that way I'm very proud. I think I'm making history every day. To me, I'm happy about that because I'm a history geek. I love history, but I'm making my own history, and because of people like myself inspire other people. They're making history too. But never forget about the past. We can learn from the past. We can make things better for the future. That's what I think that.
I mean, this has been wonderful. What a way to finish. Thank you so much, Ben, Shaun, and Simon. From I know from everybody on this call, and also if you're watching this on YouTube as well, I'm sure you have the same thoughts as me that this is an incredibly important hour 15 of your life. Thank you so much, everybody. This has been remarkable. All that's really left for me to say is one last thank you from everybody, and I think let's spread the word. Let's talk about this on Twitter, retweet the Learning Disability History, and let's get this out there, and support Ben, Shaun, and Simon to do that. Thank you so much.